Sreeram Chaulia, a foreign affairs expert and professor and vice dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. He's also joining us on the show. I want to come to you now, Mr. Chaulia. This is taking from what Pinak Chakravarti has already pointed out, that at that level, obviously the nitty-gritties of trade issues will not be discussed. But what is this constant insistence from the American side to discuss the issue of trade? After all, it was discussed at the Osaka meeting itself, and since then there has been very little time really for the two sides to iron out all the differences that would have cropped up.
Yeah, this is electoral politics, plain and simple, for populist President Donald Trump, because he came into office 2016 promising to bring back the jobs for American workers that he says were lost due to outsourcing and due to trade with especially with large developing countries like China. So India has been bracketed as one of the quote-unquote the troublemakers, which has a surplus with the US, a trade surplus. So he's been demanding the so-called reciprocal, meaning that, our tariff levels are lower than yours. And so you should actually give more access to US exports, and that he will protect the American market from Indian exports. So he has leveled a number of tariffs on us, and we have we tried to play a patient game to reason with them and to strike a bilateral accord for many months, and finally we also retaliated somewhat with our own tariffs. And there are also cases at the World Trade Organization, WTO. So the sum of this is that as Trump moves towards the re-election campaign for next November, 2020 November, he is going to raise and ratchet up the trade wars against especially against China, EU partners, but also against other developing countries like India. And he will want some kind of a deal which he can then go to the voters and say, look, I fought on your behalf with all these countries that were taking advantage of us, and finally now it is going to be evened out and we are going to get the benefits. While it is doubtful whether it's really going to benefit the US, this whole trade war, Trump has cast the die, and he cannot walk back from it now. It's a matter of prestige and political survival for him. So unfortunately, the US domestic politics has made India one of its victims, and it has been externalized. And I think Prime Minister Modi will hold his own on some of these issues, but at the same time, some concession here or there to maintain the overall strategic partnership remains, I think, India's strategy. We will remain tactful. We are not going to go, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth on this matter, because as you said, there is Kashmir, there are many other geopolitical issues for which we want United States cooperation, even though unfortunately Trump is a one-dimensional leader who only looks at economic countries from an economic perspective rather than a geostrategic. But I think Prime Minister will be trying to put across the view that, look, we are willing to cooperate and we are looking at, looking for some kind of concessions that may appease him. But end of the day, we are not going to move on fundamentals like agriculture, textiles. Those are the things, IPR, on which the US has been very militant and aggressive in seeking concessions. As a developing country, we can't do some things, and he has to understand that.
Certainly. Pinak Chakravarti, former diplomat, is joining us here on the broadcast. Sreeram Chaulia, foreign affairs expert, professor and vice dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs, also with us here. Sreeram Chaulia, I want to come to you first now on the issue of Kashmir. We've discussed the issue of trade earlier on in the show, but on Kashmir, what is it that is driving the United States really to constantly harp on the word mediation, despite the fact that India has time and again reiterated its stand that there is no question of mediation? Mr. Chaulia, before you start your answer, let me quickly point out to our viewers that the pictures that they are seeing on the right-hand side of the television screens are the latest pictures coming in from the G7 summit. You can see German Chancellor Angela Merkel there interacting with all the other world leaders, as well as the French President Emmanuel Macron there. Yes, Professor Chaulia, go ahead.
Yeah, Maha, I think the motivation, as Pinak was mentioning earlier, is this opportunistic and transactional relationship that Trump has developed with Pakistan right now to pull the American chestnuts out of the fire of Afghanistan. So essentially Trump says, I'm willing to sacrifice to some extent the trust of a long-term strategic partnership with India in order to, quickly pull out of Afghanistan through Pakistani auspices. So it shows, the complete lack of any kind of long-term strategic vision on the part of Donald Trump. And therefore, he's forcing all his interlocutors. It's not just India, almost all the major trade partners as well as strategic partners have been facing pressure from him on some matter or the other. On Kashmir, particularly, one thing that is good for us, and we know from Trump's track record, is that he is not at all bothered about human rights or humanitarian issues. So he is not raising this on account of any alleged, abuses by India in J&K. Rather, it's a very, very, as I said, a tactical way of thinking on the part of Trump that I will gain something in Afghanistan by showing some rhetorical sympathy for the Pakistani viewpoint. On the other hand, the permanent advisors in the US bureaucracy, the deep state, as many people call it, they have, a different viewpoint. And I see a tussle between them and the populist faction led by Trump. And therefore, there's no clarity on what the United States really wants.
Okay.
I very much doubt that Trump really is going to interfere or actually mediate in Kashmir. He's been talking about creating a peace plan for Israel and Palestine for the last 2 years, a so-called deal of the century. Nothing has happened. In fact, Trump has very less patience or long-term vision to be a mediator in any dispute worldwide and has no interest. He's a very domestically inclined guy. So all he's I think this storm, we will weather it. And we need to be steadfast and tell Trump what the real situation is in Kashmir Valley, how we are slowly bringing it back to normal, and tell him actually that the problem lies with the cross-border terrorism, the problem lies with the aggression on the part of Pakistan, and Trump needs to interfere there and restrain the Pakistanis. That's all we want. I think we're going to tell them we are not heading for war, we are not interested in war, and the Pakistanis are taking you, on a wild goose chase when they tell you that there may be war and you better interfere. Frankly, Trump doesn't even care if there is war somewhere in the world. He's only looking at very narrow American interests, and in the current juncture, it may not last very long. Once the Afghan peace deal is done, I think he's going to throw away the Pakistanis like a used towel. So right now, there is a bit of a discomfort we have with the US because of this reason. We need to hold on with strategic patience, and eventually we'll weather this storm.
Professor Chaulia, 45 minutes is what has been slotted for this meeting today between Prime Minister Modi and US President Donald Trump. Of course, apart from Kashmir, there'll be several other issues. The important one we gather is the issue of trade. Right now, between Osaka and now, the ministers at the highest level, or the ministers on the two sides rather, have still not been able to meet. What then can we expect the two sides to talk on trade, because those issues are still being worked upon?
Yeah, Mahad, when the summit level meetings happen, it's mainly you can expect a kind of a restatement of principles and broad, guidelines that they give to their bureaucracies. So I think, the desire to end the spat and to find a bilateral deal is there on both sides. We don't want this trade damage to go on much further. But it's quite complex, because even with the China-US trade war, which is the biggest story that is shaking the global economy, they have had multiple rounds of back and forth, negotiations, and still no settlement.
Yes.
And it just shows that it's very difficult to satisfy Trump because, as we said before, he has got entire attention on domestic politics. So therefore, it's like, you turn on and switch off the spigot whenever he wants in order to have a leg up against his rivals in the Democratic Party. So I think we may have a series of such talks and negotiations in the future based on the general guidance given by the two leaders. I think, symbolic measures like, reducing tariffs on Harley Davidson bikes and those kind of things, we can do some more. And there are areas where the US has also been demanding medical devices and such things. There are specific items on which we have been stuck before. But the bigger picture is, look at Japan. The way Shinzo Abe has managed this trade, also a trade dispute. It's not yet a war, but a trade dispute with the US. Is he said, okay, I'll buy a little more of your agriculture products, like soybeans or something like that. And he's saying that will generate some jobs in the US. So there is now a well-rehearsed way of managing this enfant terrible, Donald Trump. and which is simply to show something on paper and look, there are ways by which being associated and close to India will help your economy, and tote up those numbers and show it to him, and there you go. He moves on. So there's, in a way, he's very, very adamant, but also very, very simple. And I think Modi has to read him well to be able to tackle somebody like that.
So we'll dwell more on these issues and the points that will come up in the discussion between Prime Minister Modi and US President Donald Trump. Professor Chaulia, do you believe that during the meeting, as Zaka is saying, when the cameras move away and the two leaders are talking one-on-one, there will be some sort of an, US urging India perhaps to start talking to Pakistan?
I think Prime Minister made the public remarks as well, and Trump mentioned that Modi told me that, Kashmir is under control and it will not blow up beyond a point. So I think if Trump has a lot on his plate. Just if you see from the way the reporters are, throwing so many questions at him about the trade war with China, about Japan, about on climate change. Trump is basically, a disruptor. He is not a creator of anything. So in that sense, he has to face a lot of flack on a lot of issues. So I don't think he is particularly, obsessed with this Kashmir mediation issue. I think privately he will convey that, our intelligence agencies and our military are all concerned that, it may lead to war with Pakistan. So he may ask Modi, what do you think can be done to prevent war? Because that's the only thing that might disrupt his Afghan withdrawal plans. Because otherwise, Trump is least bothered about the so-called self-determination or human rights or any of these other concerns. So he's primarily looking at, is this going to escalate to a point which will completely stop the Afghan peace talks? Will the Pakistanis carry out their threat, which they have been saying that they will pull troops from the western border of Afghanistan and put them on the Kashmir border on the east with India? If so, how will it disrupt the US plans? So I think we will need to tell him that the Pakistanis are into bluffing, and that you should not fall for the bluff. I think Prime Minister Modi is going to tell him very clearly, Pakistan cannot afford war with India. So don't buy their logic and their alarmist rhetoric, which is trying to trap you. And that's a good way to deal with Trump, because Trump doesn't like to be trapped, because he thinks that America first means isolation and not being involved in solving other people's problems. I think we should tell him, listen, this is not your problem. Aapko kasht nahi denge, matlab that's already we are saying we don't want to inconvenience you, because frankly, Trump is against spending American diplomatic or financial resources on anything other than core US interests.
All right.
And India is saying, don't bother, don't waste your resources. Something like that will appeal to Trump, because he'll say, wow, that means I have one less problem to solve, and that's what I like. I don't want to get involved in so many